Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargent. Now, let's get started.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. I'm Gabriella. I'm stepping in for Dina this week, and I'm very excited to be talking to Toyan Harper about reentry and rebuilding family rituals. So TJ is a lecturer and doctoral student at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice at the University of Chicago. Hi, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And just wanted to take a pause and give a shout out to whoever created that jingle. I really like that as I was sort of proving with it. So thank you.
I know. I really liked that. It's a bit different from my usual jingle. I usually host a different show. And I was like, oh yeah, this is great. This might be my favorite jingle. So yeah. But yeah, I'd love to get to know you a bit better. Do you mind introducing yourself?
I am happy to. So I grew up on the south side of Chicago. So I like to consider myself a lifelong resident, even though I've lived in several other places now outside of Chicago. I've lived in Boston for a couple of years, doing some work with the Southern New England United Church of Christ as an associate for justice ministries, where I was able to help build sanctuary churches and refugee welcoming churches and lead really critical trainings on anti-racism, a curricula for the United Church of Christ. And after doing that work for some time, I decided that I wanted to be closer to my family, as I didn't really have community in Boston and didn't really know that many people. So there was a time where I said, I have to get back to Chicago to sort of where my roots are. And how I go, what am I going to do? Once I get back to Chicago, and that's how I decided to attend graduate school, because I was in this place of uncertainty. And I said, I don't know what the next natural step is. So I just knew that I would attend graduate school in Chicago just to get me to my family piece. So at that point, I enrolled at the University of Chicago in a master's program in social policy and social work. And everyone was telling me, I think you'd be a really great fit to be a doctoral student and go on and get your PhD and do some awesome things. And I never really had considered such a thought, and I didn't think that I'd like to be at school for so long. But I was sort of coerced into this process. So now here we are, like these 5 years later into the journey where I'm almost done, assuming they don't kick me out of the university. At this time, I've gotten the opportunity to do some really engaging and meaningful research with some of the leaders of the field in criminology and sociology and social work. Yeah, it's been an all-around really great experience.
Wow. So that's a very interesting. I love sort of where your work has brought you and how it brought you back home without, I guess, knowing what to do. But it's found you what sounds like a really great area of work and really interesting and really needed as well. And soon we'll be able to call you doctor, I guess.
I don't think it's a bit called TJ, but in theory, yes.
Yeah, great. We'll have to get you back on then and we'll introduce you as Dr. TJ.
Yes.
Yeah. And yeah, 5 years is a long time. So yeah, congratulations on almost finishing.
Thank you. Yes, it's it's coming within another year or 2 years. So then that, on to the next sort of chapter.
Good luck with that. So we're going to move on to a section called Have You Met TJ? And that's where we get you to say the first thing that comes to your mind when we say a few words. So our first word is genre.
Action.
Is that like a favorite movie genre that you have?
I think so. If I'm thinking about movies, if I'm thinking about books, I probably would have gone with, historical fiction.
Do you have any favorite books in that historical fiction?
Yeah, there's the Pen Cage series, which talks about, and there's some really good books in that series, such as The Bone Tree or Natchez Burning is a really good series of books that were written about the 1950s, 1960s era in Natchez, Mississippi. It was sort of the civil rights movement and social uprising that occurred in those geographic.
Interesting. I haven't heard of that series. I don't read a lot of historical fiction, so maybe I'm going to have to have a look at that. I always do like broadening my reading lists.
It's a really good series, yes.
Good. And what about for movies?
That's a tough question. I generally like a wide range of movies. I said action immediately because I think it's probably I find myself watching most movies when things are sort of going on. But it would be hard to narrow down on some of my favorite.
Fair enough. It's like asking me what my favorite book is. I couldn't really pick one.
Absolutely the same. I guess what one caveat is probably that I love almost all Denzel Washington movies. He's my favorite actor. I think he's phenomenal. It looks really great to be in his 70s now. And it's like The Equalizer 3 is coming out, and I'm really excited to see that movie. And it's sort of an action genre.
Gosh, action when you're 70. I don't think my body could cope now. Yeah, great. And what about podcasts? Do you listen to any?
There's a podcast that the university runs actually called the Big Brains Podcast. And they just, interview a lot of intellectuals and philosophers and, writers. And I really am inspired by that because that's not sort of any of the vibes that I'm with, in terms of these really brilliant big thinkers and, artists. And so I do really enjoy that. There's another podcast, True Crime is a really interesting podcast.
Other than being about true crime, like what specifically do they talk about or what do they look at?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is actually sort of getting into, cases that have existed and then sort of walking through like different sort of sayings and scripts with people about, how these crimes are solved or, sort of what wrong. So it really gets into a lot of the details that I think is cool. And also the hypothetical situations that it can deal with.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. I'd have to have a look at that. And do you have a famous role model?
Famous role model. Now that is a question that I'm not sure. I don't know that I have a famous role model. I'm not sure.
Do you have just a role model who isn't necessarily famous?
It's probably cliche, but I would say my mother. My mother is just such a phenomenal person at UVA. And, she really, took care of my brother and I growing up. She was a single parent for a long time and worked multiple jobs. So she's always been my role model because I know that without her sort of support, love, care, and guidance, I would just not be anywhere close to bringing anybody of importance.
I think having, your parents, your mom, it's often, a person who does come up as a role model, but I think with good reason. We wouldn't be here without our parents. And often they are very inspiring because, you know, they've managed to bring you up with maybe some hardships and, you know, and they're still here. They're still sticking around with you, hopefully, and helping you even as you age. Mm-hmm. And what about a course that you've completed? Have there been any that have, you know, stood out?
Yes, there have been. I've had the pleasure of taking some really interesting classes. I'm trying to think of what some of them are. It seems like it's been a while for some of them. I took a class a long time ago on postmodern literature and imaginative thinking.
Interesting.
And this class, we pretty much read like a different book each week. And sort of analyzed the book, and we were talking about it, and it felt like Dead Poet Society. I'm not sure if you've seen that movie or read the book, but it just felt like very sacred, like getting together in this class to like do this thing again, or in like a larger book club that even though we were required to take this class, like everyone wanted to be there, which is, you know, sort of unusual. We think about like I just finished taking like the statistics sequence, and you know, no one wanted to be there, but it still was a great class, of course. But it just had a very different feeling.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's a reason why we read books for pleasure, and you know, being able to do that in class. Yeah, it sounds really fun, and that's the kind of thing I want to do one day. Just take a class just because it sounds fun, and yeah, the name of that class sounds very fancy. Postmodern literature, was it?
Yes, postmodern literature and imaginative thinking, I believe.
That's such a cool title.
Yes, it was. It was really a great class. So
Great. So we'll move on to our interview now. So I like to start off with a few definitions so that we start off with a good base. So we know where we're starting. So we know, I guess, some of the definitions and what we're going to be talking about. So the first thing I'd like to know is, what do you think a family is?
Yeah, I would identify a family as a group of people who are connected to one another on sort of a life journey, right? And I think a part of family being coming at different iterations, right? Like we may have what people consider a biological family or a chosen family, or some of the literature speaks about like fictive kin, or all of these different ways to convey like people who hold value and meaning in another person's life. So I think there are a lot of ways that can manifest itself.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there is no longer a universal definition of family?
I think in terms of what is now often referred to as the nuclear family, in some contexts, like where there are, you know, two heterosexual, cis-identifying male-female, I think that idea of a family is dated in a sense, right? And that if is being held as sort of a universal family, yes, I think we've moved sort of beyond like this nuclear family idea. I think that family now is changing in that, for example, children, right? For a long time, like when the word family was mentioned, it almost always, you know, denoted children. You know, today, I refer to just myself and my partner as a family, and we have a small dog. She's a family, right? So it's like, I think that really matters now that we have no children and we're still a family. So I think just when we think about like some of the ways that language and identities have changed, I think that sort of forces the issue where family is all like the context and dynamics of what constitutes a family would naturally follow suit.
Mm. Yes, my partner and I are in the similar situation where we don't want kids, but we've been together for a long time. We have a cat. We have a home together. Are we family? Are we not family? I think we're family, honestly, at this point. So I'm glad to see that the definition of family does include that.
I think so, at least. That it really has to be personal.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think the position of family is in our society?
Yeah, I think when I think of family, I think it really comes down to support and love. I think those are the two sort of tenets of a family, right? Like if I think about support, that can be financial support, that can be, sort of discipline as support, or that can be, encouragement as support. So I think the ways that support means, I think that's really key for family. I think the other piece of love, like that's the thing about family that I think, like when I think of my family, I just think of a large number of people who love me. People I can get on the phone and I can call them and we can talk and have a good conversation and we can just, convey that sense of love to one another and not be ashamed about it, to do it in a very open way, an honest way. I tell some of my best friends, I love you, because to me, like I say they're my best friend and they're my family, right? So it's this sort of duality.
Oh, that's lovely. And so we're going to be talking about reentry, but what is reentry and how is it related to family?
Yeah, that's the question, right? So reentry, it can mean a lot of different things. I think about reentry as a process, as the first point. Reentry is the process of going back into society post-prison, right? So it's the process of, going back into society post-prison is the first point. And I call it a process because scholars have informed us that a prisonization process happens. I'm thinking especially of Meg Comfort's book, right? Like being in prison changes people, right? It shows up in many different ways. So in part, when a person has been in prison for such a long time, or even a short time, the literature would suggest that they are still changed. So as they are now exiting prison, right, and going back into their community, they're going back into their family. That is a process. So I think that's the first part to start there. The second part of the question about its relation to family is what happens when people are, forcibly removed and extracted from their families, from their communities. They're placed in a foreign land almost, right? Like in many cases, prisons or jails can be an hour away, 2 hours away from where a person resides. Like, what does that have to do with family sort of, connectivity, right? Or connectedness is a better word. Like, what does that have to do with family connectedness, right? Like, how do family bonds endure this process, right? Like, do relationships even make it? If someone's getting 5 years, 10 years, how does that alter the family? If that person is the breadwinner and then they become incarcerated and now that breadwinner is no longer there, like what does that do to the family? What happens to the, resources that were poured into that family through this person? So I think it's a direct relationship in terms of when a person enters prison on the one hand, and when a person leaves prison, where do they go? Right? Like they've been incarcerated for X number of days, months, weeks, years. Like they're coming out oftentimes with no job, with no house. There are a lot of, discriminatory laws and policies that prevent certain interactions. In Illinois, where I live, it wasn't until recently that people were able to get a barber's license to cut hair if they had a criminal background. Like one of the things that maybe, seemingly this very trivial task to some people of cutting hair right? And you couldn't do that for a long time. You had a criminal background. So like, where's the jobs? Where's the housing? Where's the resources and support? And in many cases, that comes from the family, right? Like part of my research is on sort of family blessings and family burdens, right? Like, because it's a blessing to have this person back probably after so much time. And it can be burdensome, right? Like now we have to provide for this other person. We have to help this person get back on their feet, right? So.
Okay, interesting. Lots that I want to unpack. There's quite a few things there that I do want to unpack. But the first thing I'd like to know is you mentioned that there are some changes that people go through when they go into prison. Do you mind explaining maybe what some of those changes are?
Absolutely. So for example, loss of autonomy, right? To be told what time you have to eat, what time you have to go to sleep, what you can do, right? A regulation of space, where you can go, where you cannot go. So I think that's probably the most pronounced change is this loss of autonomy that occurs in prison. And with that loss of autonomy, it's also a loss of time, right? And there is an excellent book by Professor Michael Walker called Indefinite, Doing Time in Jail, that sort of talks about some of these issues of what time is like while you're incarcerated. And I think that is probably another piece. Like many people may not know what time it is, how much time they have until said event. So they may be continuously counting down to a certain point. They may be waiting for something, right? The concept of time changes very drastically in prison, where I can look at my clock and say it's 6:56 p.m. Most people cannot do that at prison.
Yeah, I guess I never thought about the fact that, I have my phone. I'm always seeing what the time is. I always can situate myself within the time. And I guess I have my own rituals that I follow every day. I have lunch at 12 o'clock. I have my coffee at 1 o'clock. And if you can't see the time, it's very hard to situate yourself with what you're doing every day. And how do those changes affect when you come back to the family, when you leave prison?
Absolutely. I think going back to the first point about the change of loss of autonomy, now once a person is re-entering into society, they have the ability to, take control of their autonomy again, but not necessarily having the resources and tools, right? Like to know what to do, to know how to do it, to know where to go, and these certain things, right? So it's this adjustment period sort of in the reentry process where people are figuring things out. If you think, for example, someone who is incarcerated for 20 years, the types of technological advancements that can happen, where now there's Zoom, there are iPhones, there are all of these things that, they weren't really in the works necessarily 20, 30 years ago. And it just takes some time to get used to it. So you have to adjust to catch up with the time. I keep mentioning time a lot because I'm really fascinated by this concept that, again, others like Dr. Michael Walker have mentioned and studied, because I think it's a very important point.
Yeah. So much has changed, even between like 5 years that, you leave for 5 years and everything can change so drastically. And so you also mentioned that the family changes as well. So what changes do they go through?
Absolutely. I think, what happens to if someone has a child, for example, and a lot of people we know who are incarcerated are also parents. How many birthday parties, how many, Christmas outings, all of these other types of holidays, the traditional markers in a parent-child dyad that has occurred. Like what happens to that child who's growing up? What might happen to a partner to be without their significant other throughout this time? So I think those types of changes can occur as well in terms of maybe this, significant other is now trying to explore other life partners to go with. Maybe there's this type of emotional stressor of like, am I betraying this person who I, committed my life to or committed this time to, right? Think about the people who are incarcerated, their parents, right? Like maybe their parents are sort of dealing with this sense of guilt or shame from having their children to become incarcerated. So I think all of these changes can occur. I think it's not just limited to this, but it's an array of issues that just transpire.
Mm-hmm. And so all of these changes, they make it difficult for people to come back home to re-enter into the house and into the home and into the family. So how does that play out?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. I think it's such a good question because everything that I know from the literature, from having conversations with people, from working in certain, research institutions about this, it is hard. It is really hard for people when they're coming back into society because they have been cast away. My mentor and advisor, Dr. Ruben Jonathan Miller, he, in his book, Halfway Home, he talks about it and calls it the afterlife of incarceration. And he says that, your background, your record, it follows you, quote, like a ghost, right? So this is something you cannot get rid of. You can't shake it off you, right? This idea of carceral citizenship, where you're no longer just a regular citizen, but you're a citizen who's been confined by carceral spaces.
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying before that it stops you from being able to get a job, or it can make it very hard to get a job. It can, that means it's hard to earn money and to support your family. So you're relying on your family, and that creates those stresses. Whoops. So what can people do to make that transition easier? Is there something that people can do?
Excellent question. Reentry coordinators are a thing in some spaces, right, where people are specifically working with incarcerated people who they know will be released in X number of months or weeks. There's not enough funding, of course, for reentry coordinators. In fact, in many cases, those positions are getting cut more. I think also transitional housing we need to bolster support for transitional housing, halfway homes, different mission-driven nonprofits who are doing the work to help, different religious organizations who are doing the work to help. It must be a multifaceted approach for what is definitely a very intricate problem.
So definitely governmental, organizational, and community support is very much needed to help with reentry from incarceration.
Absolutely. I think we hear the expression, it takes a village to raise a child very often, but I think that village must extend beyond children, right? It must extend to anyone who becomes in a predicament where they are now representing a marginalized identity, because anyone who occupies a marginalized identity will need support and sort of getting closer to the center, right?
Okay. But what can families do? Your mom or your dad, brother or sister coming back, maybe they're living in the same house as you, maybe they're not. What can you do to sort of bring them back into the home and into the family?
Yeah, I think one of the first things is just, consistent visits. A lot of the times, like family members may not be able to visit because of distance, time, or money. But I think as it gets closer to reentry, just to have conversations with the person who will be reentering about what they want. So often they're just left out of the picture entirely, right? Like they get a consent of release, and then they're sort of, pushed beyond the prison or the jail gates, and they're told, good luck, that they're going to gate money, which ranges, in some places it's $20 US dollars, in some places it's $100. Like, Joe, good luck, right? So I think like if family members are able to have those conversations while folks are still incarcerated, to really start planning and to really engage what they want out of the situation, that's the first step. And then to make a concrete plan, like, all right, this is sort of what the ask is. Like, what can we do to better establish that? And I think the employment piece is a really big part of it as well. As I mentioned earlier, like there are challenges at doing this. There's a long line of research, especially by Dr. Pager and others who, studied criminal back trials and sort of employment for a long time. So I think like being able to have those conversations as well, like what are you going to do once you're sort of out and you have some sense of your freedom back? Like what's sort of the next step? So to really have those conversations, to engage what the ask is, and then to with the concrete plan.
Okay. And so after you've, planned a little bit, maybe they're planning to get a job, they've decided what they're going to be doing. Are there sort of any, rituals that you can use, maybe Christmases, family birthdays, family traditions, that people can do to bring them back into the family, or is it not important?
Well, I think it is important. And at least in my sort of research and having conversations with people, I say that because it's really important to have conversations with people who so often, they don't have these conversations, but it can be overwhelming immediately once a person is released from prison, like just getting reacclimated to society and the hustle and bustle, the moving-ness of it all. So I think just introducing the folks to it in a gradual process to, bring them around certain family members and friends and small gatherings, for example. Like some folks I've talked to have said, like, I don't want a big welcome home party, right? Like, so that, that could be, not to say that everyone, they feel that way, but just I think it's important to really ask. But I think to your other point in terms of the Christmases and birthdays, I think it will depend because that family dynamic has changed depending on the time. Even if it's just been a couple of months, there's something different. So I think like first getting reacclimated to the space and to the people, and then being really careful in the thought process of what do I do, and the level of involvement that, formerly incarcerated people sort of want to have, and the ritual. And I think the last piece that I would probably add is like spirituality comes up for a lot of formerly incarcerated folks as well. Like they may want to, not that everybody wants to go to church, that's not what I'm suggesting, but that people may have this type of practice that they have learned in prison, whether that's meditation or whether it's yoga or whatever this type of ritual is for, their individual self, like to be able to do that.
So yeah, bringing in any rituals that they've developed while incarcerated into the family life, but also allowing them to have some control over, anything that they are doing with the family, and allowing them to be reintroduced slowly so that they're not, I guess, overwhelmed by everything that's happening. And okay, interesting. And how does this help with reestablishing them in the family?
Yeah, I think part of the reestablishment process is to, shore up the fact that just because they were away, that they never stopped being part of the family, right? Like sometimes distance can be equated with exclusion. So I think just to, hone in on that fact, like, you've never stopped being part of the family. And then I think in addition to that, also allowing them to slowly engage, as I mentioned, I think that's really a key piece. Like there are so many family rituals that can just change over time. So I think it's really important just to know what the rituals are before they're really getting invested in the way it is. Like even, for example, a child's extracurricular activities, for example, could change very quickly where, if someone's interested in soccer, then, 6 months later, they want to do karate, for example, like just that practice of picking up and taking a child to soccer versus karate could mean something that's like very different. There's a different group of parents there.
And I guess learning that, particularly kids, I guess their hobbies and their interests change very quickly. And so those rituals are also going to change very quickly because, one minute you're watching Bluey with your kid and the next minute they're watching something else because, it's been 2 years and they're no longer interested in Bluey. Was there anything else that you wanted to discuss for this section? Anything we haven't mentioned?
No, I think this has been some rigorous discussion. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you. So I'll move on to the practice debrief section. So what would you recommend to a family to improve their family rituals after a period of separation or absence?
Yeah, in part, I would recommend just being honest with sort of each of the family members around expectations, right? Like there can be different demands of time being placed by the formerly incarcerated person or even from, like an institutional level, like if someone's on parole, like that could come with a very different set of expectations, right? So I think everyone to be honest about their expectations is probably the first step of, getting everyone on the same page. And then I think to actually have conversation about what's going on, like what are the family rituals, right? Not that that's going to sort of be the exact question, but like just to know, like sort of what in this family has changed in this absence, right? To be able to engage one another in a meaningful way about it. And I just think that the absence is significant, like I mentioned, for no matter what that period of time is. So just being really clear about family rituals.
And are there any challenges to this?
Absolutely. I think that, there could be instances where family members may not be fully supportive of a returning person. And I think if that's the case, right, like that's also a conversation that needs to happen as well, especially if, there's a formerly incarcerated person who is in a living environment out of necessity. So just say there's an example where, John is released from ex-prison and he's now living with his, parents, and he's not able to pay any rent, for example, because he doesn't have a job. And then there's his brother who lives there, like Sam just said. So now Sam's like, oh, well, you're just freeloading. You're getting over on mom and dad. Like that's going to create a dynamic where it's obviously a lot of high tension, high stress. It's not like John has anywhere else to go. That's just the nature of this. But right, like this is a type of family dynamic that may occur where people can be a little bit antagonistic and not fully understanding of the situation of the prisonization process that's occurred.
And so I guess the only thing you could do in that situation is to just communicate that, John is trying to get a job and trying to help, but just needs a bit more time maybe. I mean, and hope that that's enough.
Absolutely. I think that's probably one of the key parts of it. And I think just in some cases that may require outside help if that's like a therapy session. Maybe John's getting some therapy to deal with that. Maybe it's Sam. Maybe there's like group or family therapy. I think that, every family, of course, is going to, have its unique way of handling the situation ahead. But I think just like being on some type of consensus about what's going on is probably the best way to prevent any of those challenges.
Okay. Yeah, so we've also got some audience questions. And our first one is sort of related to this. So what advice can you offer to families who may encounter setbacks or resistance during the process of reestablishing and maintaining family rituals?
I think the first piece of advice that I would probably say, I think the first piece of advice that I would suggest is that the family really get together as a unit and be able to have these conversations and to have the conversations at an early point. If these things fester, it's likely just going to lead to the problems getting much worse and the issues that are sort of underlying becoming exacerbated. I think that when formerly incarcerated people are returning into their homes, especially, like, they also need that autonomy. They need their own sort of way of doing things, and to really engage families about what's the best way to not feel, what's the best way to provide the supports that are needed for a formerly incarcerated person, and to not make them feel like a child, right? Who's just been, sort of giving things, or who's just being a burden. So where's that balance for a family between sort of support and autonomy? And also, like, what is it that this formerly incarcerated person is missing? Like, what is it that they don't have access to that this family may be able to provide to help?
And what happens if, say, Sam refuses to, join the discussion? They say, no, I don't want to. I think that John should just find a job and move out, without really listening to everything that John has to say and that is happening to him.
Excellent question. In one instance, that may just be a severed bond, right? Where John and Sam may be brothers biologically. They may no longer be family. So that could just, in one instance, become a severed bond. In another instance, John could really feel pressured to move out. At this point, maybe John is now searching for a halfway home. In some instances, almost upwards of 20% of people who return from prisons and jails can become homeless or temporarily unhoused, right? So maybe even in the worst scenario, John is now actually temporarily unhoused. And that, of course, in this situation would be a real disaster in the sense that it could have been prevented. But in many cases, it's not that people who were formerly incarcerated and now are temporarily unhoused, it's not that they didn't have any family at all, right? It could be this type of antagonistic relationship with their family members that may have, contributed them to say, well, I would just rather be on my own, where I don't have to be under anyone's roof. I don't have to listen to them sort of, bad mouth me.
Okay. So very complex situations though. And obviously you don't want that to happen, but I guess every family is different and every family is going to have different reactions to everything. And you can't, I guess you can try as much as possible to stop the antagonism, but sometimes I guess that's going to happen, right? So our second question from the audience is how to deal with different expectations and emotions surrounding the re-entry process and rebuilding family rituals.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. I didn't even know this question was coming from the start when I was talking about just expectations earlier. I think expectations are so important, especially in the reentry process. And having those expectations early make it really a big deal, because For example, if a person is considering multiple options as to where they live upon reentry, like having those expectations, for example, just say that a person is on electronic monitoring. They're going to be home every day, right? So like, what does that mean? Well, maybe for one family, it's like, I'm tired of seeing you every day, right? Where maybe a different family in a different sort of household will welcome that person to be home every day. So I think the expectation conversation is really important. And I think to say, how are these expectations being managed, right? Like if these expectations are established at the very, sort of forefront of the reentry process, that is a sort of covenant. It's an agreement to live by these expectations and to also have conversations where, even from the side of the formerly incarcerated person, like, you assured me of X, Y, and Z, but what can we do to make sure that you're also being able to, provide me with sort of what I need in this process? Mm-hmm. And from the reverse as well, like, what might this formerly incarcerated person, John, just say, like, be able to do for the family that he's sort of willing with that situation as well? Maybe that means like actively searching for a job, if that's one of the requirements. Like, well, how does that look? Does that mean that I'm applying to 10 jobs a day? Or does that mean that I am going to school to get my, GED, so that way I can become more eligible for a job? Like, those are very different scenarios, that would mean different things, right? Where if I'm actively applying for a job every day, and I just do a job that doesn't require any type of GED or high school diploma, maybe it's not the best paying job, for example. Maybe I can get a slightly better job with the GED, but maybe that takes, 1 year to get the GED. Like, those are very different expectations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So yeah, communicating those expectations so that no one's surprised or annoyed by what everyone else in the household is doing.
And the second point to the communicating, I think that's absolutely right. Also adhering to those expectations and sort of, allowing those expectations to, be a covenant or agreement, so that way people can be moved back and forth between those expectations.
Okay. So our last question is, can you use the same principles with your found family rather than with biological family?
I absolutely think so. In my mind, like, at least for myself, I don't use the word family loosely, right? Like, if I'm calling someone family, I mean this, from the bottom of my heart. And I don't see a distinction between found family or chosen family or, with biological family. I think that that's from a sort of lived and emotional perspective. I think that, there are different legal parameters in some cases with biological family. I'm especially thinking about, sort of, this conversation has largely been about, sort of adults reentering, but there's also the other spectrum, for when younger people become detained or incarcerated, in juvenile legal systems, and they have maybe spent X amount of time away, right? Like, that's sort of on the other spectrum. And I think in those cases, there are these types of legal expectations of, guardianship that, a legal parent has to, or a legal guardian must adhere to, like, adequately providing for this person and those sort of things, where I would say maybe that's one exception to, like, the biological versus sort of the found and chosen.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Was there anything else that you wanted to discuss, or we'll move on to the open mic?
The only piece that I think that I would add is just to say that, we, of course, do not live in a perfect world, and how we got to the prison system initially. I guess this is sort of open mic.
Yes. Well, actually, why don't I introduce the open mic and then we'll discuss this.
Perfect.
Okay. So our next section is the open mic, and that's where you, the guest, get to talk about something that you're passionate about. And it doesn't have to be related to the topic, but it can be related to the topic if you want it to be. So what did you have in mind for today?
Thank you for that. My open mic contribution is sort of what comes next, like what comes after prison. And I just want to talk a little bit. I won't go on forever, but when we think about this, prison in its current, just state was the reform, right? Like prior to this, prior to the conceptualization of the prison, people were just being beheaded, at the, request of the monarch, right? So there's this campaign to say like, well, we should do something other than simply behead and execute people. We should think of something different. So, and we get the prison, right? Which seems like a massive improvement from the beheading process. And in many cases at that time, I'm sure it was. And now we also get the prison that we have today, which, in America, so many people are incarcerated, are detained. 600,000 people are re-entering from prisons, from jails each year in this country. We are the world's largest jailer of both adults and young people. And this is no longer the 1970s case of rehabilitation that, we were, as a society, forced into believing, and that somehow sending people to prison, incarcerating them would allow them to become reformed citizens, to become, better citizens. This rehabilitation model, which we now would say is debunked. And instead, the prisons in many cases have become a facet of incapacitation, where people are simply held in prisons, where people who we are tired of seeing, tired of looking at, tired of wanting to exist. And we know this to be the case because of how many people are poor people, how many people are Black people who are being sent away into prison. So I think just to really take some time to think about all of the disparities that exist within prisons, that Black people are 5 times more likely to become incarcerated than their white counterparts, for example, to think about all of these things and to say, like, how is it that we can reimagine what it means to have accountability, what it means to have public safety, and to live in a just society where we are not permanently punishing people. Like when does that punishment end? And based on this system, we know that well into the reentry process, people are still endeavoring and enduring the consequences of their incarceration.
So what types of steps do you think that, the government, people can make to the system? Obviously, it's a huge topic, and I'm sure that it could cover so many podcasts, far more than just today. But I mean, maybe just one or two, or the big ones. I don't know.
Absolutely. I think decarceration is probably the first point, right? Decarceration in the sense of how can we get as many people out of prisons and jails as possible, right? During COVID, for example, we saw many different types of decarceration efforts, largely around older adults, for example. Like, what does that look like for someone who's, 75 years old to be in prison? Like, what are the chances? I'm not saying that they're not existent, but what are the chances of these 75-year-old incarcerated people who may have a litany of health issues committing these types of crimes, right? That's sort of one population, for example. Nonviolent offenders is something that comes up in many cases. Like, what does that look like for those who have, drug use charges, right? To actually get treatment and to receive care and not incarceration, treatment and care and not incarceration, right? Like, what does that look like in terms of the sort of those who've been charged with drug crimes? And also the supports from the government, I think are very key to the second point, right? The way that prisons and jails in Americas are, they are even the physical structures are not conducive to rehabilitation, right? Like, these are massive buildings with barbed wire gates and, constant surveillance, right? Where we look at other types of prison structures, like, for example, in New Zealand, where the literal structure of the prison is very different, where there are open spaces, where there are accessible books, where there are, engagement with the, facility staff, right? It's not this, animus between correctional guards and those who are incarcerated, where it's more of a almost collegial relationship. So I think that's a large part of it, is decarceration and sort of government support and structure to, like, doing a new thing. We know this is not working because nothing in terms of the crime rates are not improving. Recidivism rates are high. So, right, this leads us to conceptualize something new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I didn't know that about New Zealand prisons. And I mean, I don't have much experience with prisons in general, and especially in the US, because I'm not in the US. But yeah, interesting. Let me have a think about what I want to say. There's certainly a lot to think about there, I think. The fact that it's not working and something needs to change. There's that's certainly showing us, that it's not working and we should change something. I don't have much more to say than that, actually. So thank you so much for talking to me today, TJ. If people do want to find out more about you, where should they go?
Yeah, it was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. I hope to come back again if I didn't, offend too many people. And yeah, I can be found via Twitter. My name on Twitter is at Toyan Harper. So that's TOYANHARPER. And also my email is tjharper@uchicago.edu, where I'd be more than happy to engage in dialogue.
Great. And thank you. We'll put those in the show notes so people can find them easily. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was a very interesting conversation. And even though I'm overwhelmed, I think, with thoughts. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me.
You've been listening to Altogether, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargent, and thanks for tuning in.